During February 1944, following the successful Marshall Islands campaign and the revelation of Truk's vulnerabilities, Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher departed with 2 task groups of Task Force 58 toward the Mariana Islands. An enemy reconnaissance aircraft detected the naval formation on the 22nd, leading to a series of nocturnal attacks repelled by naval gunfire. The following morning, carrier-based aircraft struck Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, eliminating 150 newly arrived torpedo bombers on airfields, while obtaining valuable reconnaissance photographs of potential landing areas. On March 12, 1944, the Joint Chiefs of Staff ordered Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Ocean operations, to advance toward the Marianas by mid-June and the Palaos by mid-September, establishing forward bases to control approaches to Formosa and the Philippine archipelago. The recent successful raid on Truk convinced Nimitz that capturing the island would require excessive casualties and resources. Instead, he chose to neutralize it through isolation. Securing the Marianas would cut off Truk while providing the Navy with advanced bases for attacking enemy sea lanes and launching further amphibious operations. Army air forces had begun long-range attacks on the homeland using B-29 superfortresses from Chinese bases. Operating from the Marianas would reduce flight distances by 800 miles with corresponding payload increases. The Joint Chiefs Directive also required fast carriers to support General Douglas MacArthur's army forces in an amphibious assault on Hollandia, located on New Guinea's northern coast. This target lay beyond land-based air support range, and Task Force 58 demonstrated carrier force strategic flexibility by fulfilling this requirement. Admiral Raymond Spruance and his Central Pacific Force departed Majuro on March 22, 1944, with 3 carrier task groups. When enemy search planes spotted them en route, Spruance accelerated the timeline, attacking on March 30th instead of the planned April 1st. Enemy aircraft attacked the force during the evening of the 29th without success, and hundreds of fighters and attack aircraft spent March 30th and half of the 31st devastating the Palaos, sinking vessels, destroying numerous aircraft, and mining major harbor channels. 1 task group struck Yap in the Caroline Islands, while all 3 groups subsequently attacked Wole. Although Wole offered limited targets, Commander Samuel Dealey navigated the submarine harder into extremely shallow waters, scraping the bottom to rescue a downed carrier pilot under enemy fire. Organizational changes occurred during this period. On April 26, 1944, Spruance's Central Pacific Force became the 5th Fleet. In May, Admirals King and Nimitz established a dual command system, with Admiral Spruance commanding the 5th Fleet and Admiral William Halsey commanding the 3rd Fleet. The operating forces remained identical, but the 2 commanders and their staffs would alternate, allowing one to conduct operations while the other planned subsequent campaigns. On April 13, 1944, Admiral Mitcher sailed from Majuro with Task Force 58, comprising 5 Essex-class fleet carriers and 7 Independence-class light carriers. After striking New Guinea targets from April 21st through 24th, the carriers turned north, revisited Truk, then returned to Majuro while gunnery ships bombarded Satawan and Ponape. General MacArthur's landings at Étape and Hollandia proceeded successfully, prompting him to order another westward advance to the small offshore island of Wakde. Within days, another landing targeted the larger island of Biak. The enemy naval command assumed the main Allied thrust would advance through New Guinea and that Task Force 58 was now committed to supporting General MacArthur. They planned a naval counterstrike to bring the American carrier force to battle in the Caroline Islands area between New Guinea and the Marianas. The finest available forces, including carriers, concentrated at Tawi-Tawi and formed the mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Hisaburo Ozawa, an experienced naval aviator. Planners recognized that Task Force 58 outgunned the new mobile fleet and supplemented their carrier aircraft with land-based aviation. This made holding Biak with its airfield essential within range of the anticipated battle area. Considerable air strength moved to bases in New Guinea and the adjacent Moluccas, while a powerful surface force assembled in the Moluccas to strike MacArthur at Biak. Before the Biak strike could commence, Mitcher's carriers arrived off the Marianas and began attacking defences and airfields. Upon learning of this development, the High Command realized the situation and ordered their naval striking forces north from Tawi-Tawi and the Moluccas to rendezvous in the Philippine Sea. As Allied forces crossed the English Channel to attack Fortress Europe, Task Force 58 led the advance across 1,000 miles of open ocean. During their approach, Army bombers struck airfields in the Mariana Islands, but aerial preparation for this invasion relied solely on the carriers. On June 11, 1944, Mitchell launched his first carrier strikes against minimal opposition. Much enemy air power had been relocated south to face MacArthur. Battleships and cruisers from Task Force 58 bombarded Saipan and Tinian, while two task groups steamed north to strike Bonin Islands bases. Saipan, the primary objective, differed significantly from Tarawa or Kwajalein. 14 miles long, mountainous, and defended by 32,000 troops, its fortifications could not be eliminated by pre-landing bombardment. It required rapid capture since enemy counterattacks were certain. The landing force arrived off Saipan on June 14th, and bombardment ships began their methodical work. Early on the 15th, ships' gunfire was restricted to within 1,000 yards of the beaches, while carrier aircraft targeted active guns on Saipan and nearby Tinian and prevented reinforcements from reaching the landing area. Before hour, ships' guns ceased fire as 165 aircraft from Task Force 58 struck assigned targets along the landing beaches. This final strike aimed more to demoralize defenders than destroy specific defenses. Marines went ashore with heavy fire support from ships and support craft, but sustained significant casualties from defensive positions that had survived bombardment. Artillery and mortars in hills behind the beach were pre-registered on the beaches and outlying reef, inflicting losses. Supporting aircraft, assigned to specific areas and controlled by flight leaders and an airborne coordinator, attacked targets of opportunity. This marked the first operation where fast carrier aircraft provided close support to landing forces. Service requests came rapidly, especially during early days before Marine artillery could come ashore. A network of command posts and liaison officers effectively filtered and coordinated mission requests with available aircraft. Support missions ranged from heavy attacks before general advances to precise strikes at individual targets by small aircraft numbers using dive bombing, glide bombing, rocket attacks, or strafing as missions demanded. On the morning of June 16th, submarine contact reports informed Admiral Spruance that the enemy mobile fleet was approaching the Marianas. An Army division landed to reinforce the Marines on Saipan by the next day, and the American attack began advancing against fierce resistance. Marines severed the island on June 18th as Army troops captured the principal airfield and turned to push north on the 19th. Meanwhile, the fleet moved to counter the enemy thrust. Task Force 58 had been waiting west of the Marianas, hoping for such action. It now formed 4 task groups with 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers. Mitchell knew that enemy carrier aircraft had longer strike ranges than his own. He wanted to steer westward and attack early on June 19th to prevent Ozawa's aircraft from shuttling between their carriers and Guam. Hitting American carriers on both flights and achieving 2 strikes for 1, Spruance declined Mitchell's proposal. The main objective, as Spruance viewed it, was protecting the landing forces as they captured the Marianas, and moving too far west could leave amphibious forces vulnerable to an enemy flanking maneuver. Additionally, contact reports were uncertain, and no one could determine the Mobile fleet's exact location. Under these circumstances, remaining close to the Marianas appeared best. Ozawa assumed that Spruance would stay within range of the Marianas, as he indeed did. Aircraft from Guam and Rota were to open the attack, severely damaging Task Force 58 before carrier aircraft began shuttle runs between the Mobile fleet and Guam. Enemy scout planes spotted Task Force 58 during the afternoon of June 18th, and Ozawa prepared to attack early on the 19th. His van force, 3 task groups formed around single light carriers, advanced 100 miles ahead of the main body, 2 3-carrier task groups. If the Americans attacked, the van force was to blunt its force before reaching the main body. On the morning of June 19th, 1944, approximately 300 aircraft took off from Ozawa's carriers. The first part of the enemy plan unraveled. Many Guam-based aircraft had been destroyed on the ground or while en route from the homeland. The small number of aircraft remaining on Guam attempted to launch an attack that morning, but carrier fighters engaged them and reinforcements trying to fly in from Truk, and the attack failed. Task Force 58 had taken up air defense stations. The four carrier task groups were in tight circular formation, surrounded by rings of cruisers and destroyers arranged for maximum all-around gunfire. The 7 fast battleships of the force, with their own screening ships, were in their own formation between the carriers and the enemy. Spaced 12 to 15 miles apart, the task groups were positioned to support each other against air attack or counter any attempt at an end run against Saipan. The advantage lay with them. Ozawa had 430 aircraft, where Task Force 58 had 891, and there was a wide difference in the relative experience of the opposing aircrews. The enemy aircraft came in 4 separate raids. The first came from the van force. Radar detected it at 10 o'clock, and Mitchell immediately launched over 450 fighters. He then launched all his attack aircraft, clearing them from the area while fighters landed to refuel and rearm before launching again. Fighter directors in the task force vectored the F-6Fs to meet the incoming raid. They attacked from above and shot down nearly half the incoming aircraft. Some reached the battleship task group, only to be driven off by heavy anti-aircraft fire. One bomb hit the battleship South Dakota, causing casualties but no serious damage. The second raid was similarly decimated by fighters before reaching the battle line. One aircraft crashed into the side of Indiana, and 2 near misses on the carrier Bunker Hill started fires that were quickly extinguished. Nearly all aircraft of the third raid went astray and never found the task force. The last raid approached in groups, inflicted minor damage, and was shattered between the task force and Guam, losing all but 11 of 82 aircraft. Simultaneously, 2 United States submarines approached the main body and mortally wounded the carriers Shokaku and Taiho. Some of Ozawa's pilots reported Task Force 58 badly damaged, and he turned westward to refuel and prepare for another attack the next day. When he discovered he had lost more than 3/4 of his air strength, he decided to wait another day. Task Force 58 recovered its aircraft from what its pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Spruance was now ready to launch his own attack. One task group remained to keep enemy airfields inactive, and the others headed west through the night. Late in the afternoon on June 20th, the enemy intercepted an American contact report. Realizing that an attack would follow, they increased speed, hoping to pull away. Mitchell, however, had decided that the risk of a night return at sea was worth taking to strike a decisive blow at the enemy fleet, and he launched 216 aircraft before turning toward the Mobile fleet to close the distance. The search pilot then radioed that his initial contact report had been erroneous, and the enemy fleet was 60 miles further from Task Force 58 than originally plotted. Mitchell decided not to recall the strike already en route, but cancelled a second strike that was to follow. The squadrons flew more than 300 miles to sight their targets just before sunset. Dive and torpedo bombers sank the carrier Hio and 2 oilers, damaged carriers Chiyoda and Zuikaku, a battleship and a cruiser. Anti-aircraft guns and Zero fighters downed 20 of Task Force 58's aircraft, but the stricken carriers took many of their own aircraft with them. By the action's end, Ozawa had 35 of his original 430 aircraft remaining. The return to the carriers became one of the war's legendary stories. With fuel tanks draining, the aircraft flew through darkness. Some, in more dire condition than others, began going down. The task groups had dispersed to give themselves ample sea room to recover aircraft. Shortly after 2000 hours, the first aircraft were detected approaching the task force, and the carriers turned into the wind. Mitchell now faced a dilemma. If he illuminated his darkened force, he would risk attack by enemy submarines or aircraft. If he left them dark, many aircrew would perish in the ocean. For both military and humanitarian reasons, he ordered, "Turn on the lights." Ships activated their running lights, searchlights pointed skyward, and 5-inch guns fired star shells into the air. Aircraft landed wherever and however they could. Others went into the water as destroyers moved between carriers to retrieve them. Several aircraft ignored wave-offs and crash-landed, causing casualties on flight decks. Enterprise saw the most unusual landing as 2 aircraft landed simultaneously, catching different arresting wires and emerging intact. By 22:30 that night, recovery was complete. Task Force 58 headed toward the day's action area, tracing the strike's course and searching for survivors in the water. Through the next day, aircraft searched for enemy stragglers but found none. On the evening of June 21st, Task Force 58 turned toward the Marianas. The Turkey Shoot was now history, and Task Force 58 could devote time and attention to supporting the conquest of Saipan, then neighboring Tinian and Guam. The Pacific Fleet now had advanced bases from which to threaten Western Island groups and attack sea communications between the homeland and East Indies oil fields, and the Army could now bomb the homeland at much closer range than previously. Though not realized at the time, the enemy high command was now convinced that the war could have only one outcome. During the Second World War, the skies over France and Germany were the responsibility of the United States Army Air Forces and Britain's Royal Air Force. Naval aviation had limited opportunities to engage enemy forces. Although a fast carrier task force was not present to support the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, naval aviators did participate in history's greatest amphibious invasion. Later, in August, when southern France was invaded, naval aviators again took part. Cruiser Scouting Squadrons 7 and 8 and Observation Flying Squadron 1 each fought during the summer of 1944. The P-51 Mustang belonged to the 361st Fighter Group Command in England. Credit for the lack of strong Luftwaffe opposition to the amphibious landings in France must be given to Army Air Force fighter groups like the 361st. Their strategic operations forced the Luftwaffe to deploy its fighter assets in Germany for homeland defense, where they would have little effect on the battleground in France. On August 12, the lead aircraft, Lu 4th, being flown by the 361st Group Commanding Officer Colonel Thomas Christian, was destroyed, eliminating Colonel Christian. Invading Fortress Europe was not easy, nor was it without cost. Naval aviation's mission on June 6 was to provide air spotting support for cruisers and battleships bombarding targets along the Normandy beachhead. For this purpose, each vessel normally carried several aviators and 2 or 3 float planes, either SOC Seagulls or OS-2U Kingfishers. Both aircraft performed the spotting mission effectively. Operations in the Mediterranean during 1943 had shown, however, that against strong enemy aerial opposition, the SOCs and OS-2Us were too vulnerable. They lacked the speed and maneuverability to escape attacks by Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft and Messerschmitt 109 aircraft. In the Mediterranean, efforts were being made to train VCS pilots in handling fighters such as the P-40 Warhawk and P-51 Mustang. Flying fighters, air spotting pilots stood a much better chance of eluding enemy air attacks. Perhaps because of high demand for P-51s for strategic bomber escort duties, it was decided that 17 VCS and battleship observation pilots aboard the cruisers Quincy CA-71, Tuscaloosa CA-37 and Augusta CA-31, and the battleships Nevada BB-36, Arkansas BB-33, and Texas BB-35 would be checked out in Royal Air Force Spitfire Mike VBZs. The 67th Tactical Reconnaissance Group, 9th Air Force, under command of Colonel George W. Peck, was assigned the task of checking out the VCS-7 aviators in Spitfires. Training was conducted at the 67th base in Middle Wallop, Hampshire. The training syllabus consisted of defensive fighter tactics, aerobatics, navigation, formation flying, and spotting procedures. On May 8th, Lieutenant Robert W. Calland, senior aviator aboard Nevada, assumed command of the squadron. He was relieved by Lieutenant Commander William Denton, Jr., senior aviator aboard Quincy, on the 28th. That same day, the squadron became fully operational and moved to Royal Naval Air Station Lyon-Solent. 10 squadrons, 5 Royal Air Force, 4 Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm, and VCS-7, were brought together at Lyon-Solent to provide air spotting for the fire support ships of the Western and Eastern Naval Task Forces. The Western Naval Task Force, Rear Admiral Alan G. Kirk commanding, would land the United States First Army on beaches Utah and Omaha. The Eastern Naval Task Force would land the British Second Army on beaches Gold, Juno, and Sword. 2 of the Royal Air Force squadrons, numbers 26 and 63, flew Spitfires. The other 3, numbers 2, 268 and 414 flew Mustang Is and IAs. The four Fleet Air Arm squadrons, numbers 808, 897, 885, and 886, were assigned Seafire Thirds, basically navalized Spitfire Maung Vebs. On day, all aircraft were pooled. This meant that VCS-7 flew whatever type was available, either Seafire or Spitfire. Although Mustangs were present, they were not flown by any VCS-7 aviators as they had not been checked out in the type. At noon on day, the Royal Air Force Mustangs were withdrawn for tactical reconnaissance duties. This left approximately 95 aircraft available for air spotting support at Royal Naval Air Station Lyon-Solent. Typical spotting missions utilized 2 aircraft. The lead plane functioned as the spotter. The wingman, or weaver, provided escort and protected the flight against enemy aerial attack. The clocking, or ship control method, was utilized on the majority of spotting sorties. Standard altitude for spotting missions was 6,000 feet, but poor weather forced the spotter to operate between 1,500 and 2,000 feet. Occasionally, missions were flown at even lower altitudes. Drop tanks were used to increase range. A typical spotting sortie lasted close to 2 hours. This provided 45 minutes on station and 1 hour in transit. The Luftwaffe was rarely encountered, although 6 of the station's aircraft were shot down by enemy fighters. 4 VCS-7 pilots were attacked by Mi-109 and Fue-190 aircraft, putting the fine defensive capabilities of the Spitfire to the test. All 4 aviators successfully avoided being shot down. Flak, however, was common and accounted for the squadron's only loss, Lieutenant Richard M. Barclay, senior aviator aboard Tuscaloosa. Lieutenant Barclay's wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Charles S. Zinn, also from Tuscaloosa, managed to return home despite severe damage to his right wing and aileron. The exact number of aircraft lost by VCS-7 during the Normandy campaign cannot be verified. VCS-7's action report mentions only the loss of Lieutenant Barclay's aircraft. Author David Brown, in his book, The Seafire, The Spitfire That Went to Sea, claims VCS-7 lost 7 aircraft to enemy action and 1 operationally in 209 sorties flown. Unfortunately, Mr. Padia, Brown fails to cite the source of his information. According to VCS-7's action report, the squadron flew a total of 191 sorties between June 6th and 25th. The busiest days were the 6th, 7th, and 8th. During those 3 days, a total of 94 sorties were flown. Following the bombardment of Cherbourg on June 26th, naval gunfire support operations ceased. The fighting had moved inland out of range of the ship's big guns. VCS-7 was therefore disbanded by order of Rear Admiral Kirk, and all personnel returned to their ships. During 20 days of combat operations, the aviators of VCS-7 were awarded 9 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 6 Air Medals, and 5 Gold Stars in lieu of additional air medals. 10 VCS-7 aviators went on to participate in the invasion of southern France, and 3 others took part in the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in the Pacific during 1945. The operations in the Mediterranean had shown that SOCs and OS-2Us were too vulnerable to operate effectively in skies infested with enemy fighters. An alternative to their use had to be found. Vice Admiral H. Kent Hewitt, Commander, Western Naval Task Force, convened a conference in January of 1944. Representatives of the Royal Air Force, Fleet Air Arm, United States Navy, and staff gunnery officers attended. The purpose of the meeting was to decide which available aircraft would be most suitable for the air spotting mission. The aircraft chosen was the P-51 Mustang. Time did not permit training Navy VCS, VO pilots to fly the P-51 in time for Operation Shingle, the amphibious invasion of Anzio. So the Navy trained Army Air Force's fighter pilots to perform the spotting mission. Ideally, the Navy needed to train fighter pilots in handling the air spotting mission, and in December the first steps toward this goal were being made. The problem was the urgent demand for fighter observation pilots in theater. On January 5, 1944, Commander Cruiser Division 8 requested that Commander-in-Chief, Mediterranean, arrange for the training of 4 naval aviators from Brooklyn CL-40 in high-speed aircraft. The request was approved, and on January 15th, the commanding officer of VCS-8, Lieutenant Delwine A. Liane, reported to Bertaux, Algeria, with 3 other VCS-8 aviators from Brooklyn to commence training in P-40 Warhawks. In February, aviators from Philadelphia's CL-41 aviation unit joined those from Brooklyn. Fighter training for both vessels' aviation units continued through spring, and in April the naval aviators began checking out in P-51 Mustangs. On April 21st, Commander, United States Naval Forces, Northwest African Waters, approved the assignment of 9 naval aviators to the 111th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron, flying F-6A Mustangs. The F-6A was the camera-carrying reconnaissance version of the Allison-engine P-51 Mustang. This was the beginning of a 4-month association between the 111th and VCS-8. The naval aviators continued training in P-51s, and soon began flying operational missions in support of the campaign in Italy. On June 15th, Lieutenant Junior Grade Harold J. Eckert of Brooklyn's aviation unit was flying an F-6A on a reconnaissance mission when his leader was shot down by anti-aircraft fire. He circled his downed comrade until homing stations could get a fix on his location. Eckert then continued the mission alone. Poor weather forced him to fly within the effective range of enemy flak positions, and his aircraft was badly damaged. The 111th's War Diary recorded Lieutenant Junior Grade Eckart's return. Lieutenant Junior Grade Eckart, a Navy pilot, came back from his mission with holes in the scoop of his plane. Gas and oil were pouring out, making Lieutenant Eckart a very lucky guy to be back. For his actions, Lieutenant Junior Grade Eckart was awarded an Army Air Medal. Late in July, 10 brand-new P-51C Mustangs were delivered to the 111th for use exclusively by VCS-8 aviators. The invasion of southern France began on August 15th, and by August 30th, Commander, Task Force 86, requested that all naval aviators assigned to the 111th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron return to their ships. In all, 11 flyers from VCS-8 participated in combat operations from the cockpits of 111th P-51 Mustangs. On December 15, 1943, VOF-1 was established at Naval Air Station, Atlantic City, New Jersey, Lieutenant Commander William F. Bush Bringle commanding. Equipped with Chance Vought 4U Corsairs, and later Grumman F-6F Hellcats, this squadron was the first of its kind in the Navy. A fighter unit trained specifically to perform the air spotting mission in Navy fighter aircraft. Reporting to the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Lawton, Oklahoma, on April 6, 1944, VOF-1 was given extensive training in artillery spotting. The squadron employed an air spotting system in which the aviator instructed the gun crew when and where to fire. He also made the adjustments on the target. The naval aviators first tested this system from the back seat of Army L-4 Grasshoppers Piper Cubs, and then began using the system from the cockpits of their Hellcats. The system worked and was utilized in operations over southern France. VOF-1 began trading in its F-6F-3s for new F-65s on June 16. 28 of the new Hellcats were received, and on the 29th the squadron embarked aboard Tulagi CVE-72 bound for the Mediterranean Sea. Plans for Operation Anvil Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, called for 2 Navy escort carriers, Tulagi and Kassan Bay CVE-69, to form Task Group 88.2 under command of Rear Admiral Calvin T. Durgin. Tulagi and Kassan Bay joined 7 Royal Navy baby flatops, forming Task Force 88. The carriers would supply aircraft for close air support and air spotting for naval bombardment during the amphibious landings, which were to commence at 8 o'clock on August 15th. VOF-1 officially entered the war on August 15th at 6:02, when Tulagi launched several of the squadron's Hellcats on a spotting mission for Philadelphia. 6 more spotting missions were flown during the day before Tulagi's deck was secured after the last flight returned at 17:08 hours. Much to the chagrin of VOF-1's aviators, the Luftwaffe did not vigorously contest the landings. Opportunities to engage in air combat were few, but did occur. On the 19th at 17:01, Tulagi launched 4 VOF-1 Hellcats on a tactical reconnaissance mission to the Rhone River, between the cities of Valence and Lyon. The flight consisted of the executive officer, Lieutenant Commander John H. Sandor, Lieutenant René E. Pucelle, and ensigns David E. Robinson and Archie R. Wood. At 1815, two Heinkel He 111 tactical bombers were sighted north of Vienne, heading south at low altitude. Realizing they had been seen, the Heinkels split, one heading north, the other heading south. Lieutenant Pucelle and Ensign Wood bracketed the northbound plane, with Pucelle making the first run. The He 111 began to smoke. Ensign Wood then dove in from 6 o'clock high and continued firing until the aircraft burst into flames and crashed. Lieutenant Commander Sandor and Ensign Robinson meanwhile jumped the southbound plane. Commencing a modified high-side run from the 3 o'clock position, Robinson scored hits along the He 111's fuselage and starboard engine. The stricken aircraft started down and crashed into a field. The flight reformed and continued its reconnaissance of the area, heading south. Another He 111 was sighted south of Vienne, heading north at low altitude. Ensign Wood peeled off at 2,000 feet and rolled into a firing run, attacking the Heinkel from above and behind. Both engines were set on fire. The aircraft exploded and crashed. On the way home, the 4 Hellcats swooped over an aerodrome near Montélimar, and Lieutenant Pucelle strafed a Junkers Ju-88 parked in a revetment. Before the marauding Hellcats were finished, they managed to locate a locomotive and engaged in the sport of train busting, a favorite pastime of Army Air Force's Mustang and Thunderbolt pilots. In the attack, the locomotive was claimed as destroyed and 10 boxcars were left burning. 2 days later, on the 21st, 3 Junkers Ju-52 transports were shot down during a fighter-bomber attack on a retreating transport convoy near La Capella. Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward W. Olszewski accounted for 2, and Ensign Richard Yenser claimed the 3rd. Flak was encountered on nearly every mission and accounted for VOF-1's 3 losses. Lieutenant David S. Crockett was shot down while spotting over Toulon Harbour on August 20th. He bailed out and was taken prisoner by enemy troops. He was released on the night of the 23rd when the fort in which he was being held surrendered. He returned to Tulagi on the 26th. Lieutenant James M. Alston was shot down on August 20th while attacking a transport convoy 5 miles north of Carcassonne. Lieutenant Alston successfully evaded capture and was waiting on the docks at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, when VOF-1 returned to the States in September. Lieutenant Junior Grade John H. Coyne was reported missing in action after he failed to return from an attack on a transport convoy northwest of Nimes on August 21st. He managed to bail out, and his parachute was seen opening at extremely low altitude. However, he did not survive his fall. During operations in support of Anvil Dragoon, VOF-1 aviators flew a total of 122 missions, consisting of 74 combat air patrol sorties, 96 air spotting sorties, and 238 fighter-bomber, armed reconnaissance sorties. 6 enemy aircraft were shot down in air combat, 23 locomotives were either damaged or destroyed, and 601 motor vehicles were claimed destroyed or damaged. Anvil Dragoon officially ended on September 15th when the Southern Invasion Force became the United States 6th Army Group. Let us not forget any squadrons or units that participated. No matter how small or seemingly insignificant their contributions may have been, each had a role to play in achieving final victory. While the heat of battle might occasionally force someone to decide whether or not to lay down his life, there are only a few examples of organized units whose mission was to sacrifice themselves. In modern history, no group is as well known as the kamikaze pilots during the late Pacific War. The so-called suicide pilots of the Imperial Army and Navy were not the intoxicated automatons that Western press portrayed them as. This form of wartime journalism, however understandable, was largely untrue. Ridicule was the only way to explain to an incredulously fearful hometown audience, as well as the sailors in the targeted ships, why an enemy pilot would deliberately plunge himself and his aircraft into their ship, destroying himself in the process. Soviet Air Force pilots occasionally rammed enemy bombers during the opening phases of the Nazi onslaught. Army pilots also resorted to ramming American B-29s as fleets of the giant, well-protected bombers roamed over the home islands by late 1944. Nazi Germany tried several desperate measures to counter the growing fleets of Allied bombers. The Bachem Bar 349 Natter Viper, a vertically launched, rocket-propelled interceptor, was armed with 24 73mm unguided rockets in the nose. The Natter, though flight-tested with limited success, was never used in combat. The enemy was interested in this disposable interceptor, but only constructed a few examples before war's end. By late 1943, many senior officers knew that the overwhelming strength of the Allies, spearheaded by American industry and technical expertise, would soon win the war, no matter how strenuous a defense they offered. A way had to be found to slow the advance toward the home islands, or to make the Allied offensive as costly as possible. Turning to the innate dedication to their emperor, several leaders considered suicide squadrons, whose pilots would use outmoded aircraft loaded with bombs in a final, long-reaching thrust against the Allied carrier groups that were edging toward the homeland. In June 1944, senior commanders offered a plan to Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi to form dedicated suicide squadrons. "Provide me with 300 planes, and I will turn the tide of the war," promised Captain Motoharu Okamura, an air group commander. Onishi finally gave his permission to organize these units, designated Special Attack Squadrons, that would become the kamikaze, meaning divine wind, to repel the Allied invaders, much as a legendary wind had risen to disperse a Mongol fleet in 1281. Each suicide unit used a different name, such as Tokotai, meaning special attack, Shimpu, another way of reading the letters that spelled kamikaze, and Tai, Atari, body crashing. But kamikaze has come to mean the entire corps of special attack squadrons. The kamikazes were dead men the moment they took off, and had no honorable choice but to complete their missions or be shot down in the process. We can only guess at these pilots' last thoughts. Historians have speculated over the years on how many of the kamikazes were truly volunteers. The ideals of family honor, patriotism, and above all, devotion to the emperor were strong motivations. Even the most unrelenting had only to look skyward at the fleets of Allied bombers over the homeland or out to sea, at the vast array of ships of all types that dotted the waters of harbors, once home to only the Imperial Navy. Eventually, members of the 201st Air Group in the Philippines were selected to mount the first special attack operation against the invading American fleet in October 1944. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, a graduate of the Naval Academy at Etajima, would lead the flight. At dawn on October 20th, Lieutenant Seki led his squadron off, but they soon returned, unable to locate any Allied ships in bad weather. After 3 more days of launches and aborted attacks, the Special Attack Corps accomplished its first strikes. On October 25th, Seki and his fellow pilots found a task force of United States aircraft carriers in Leyte Gulf. He dove his Zero, followed by 4 other pilots, into the carriers. Seki is generally credited with hitting the escort carrier St. Lo CVE-63, which eventually sank, while the other kamikaze pilots damaged Kalinin Bay CVE-68, Kitkun Bay CVE-71, and White Plains CVE-66. The initiation of the suicide squadrons was a horrific introduction for Allied crew who would take the brunt of the furious kamikaze attacks off Okinawa and the homeland beginning in March 1945. 2 dedicated suicide weapons were the MXY-7 Oka Cherry Blossom and the Khitan human torpedo. The Oka was a single-seat, rocket-propelled aircraft that was more of a flying bomb. Mass-produced between September 1944 and March 1945, 755 Model 11 Okas were delivered. 850, 2 Okas of all models were produced, including Model 22s, a smaller version, Model 33s, larger Okas, and Model 43s 2-seaters. The Model 11 carried a 2,646-pound warhead in the nose, a fairly large amount of explosive. Modified Mitsubishi G4M2 Betty bombers carried the Model 11 to the battle zone before releasing the Oka about 20 miles from the target. The Oka's 3-rocket engine produced 1,764 pounds of thrust for approximately 10 seconds, allowing the tiny aircraft to reach just over 400 miles per hour before the pilot started his dive. The first Oka operation came on March 21st. 1945, when 18 Bettys approached Task Group 58, the American fleet nearing Okinawa. 3 Hellcat squadrons intercepted the enemy force some 70 miles from the task group. VF-17 and VBF-17 from Hornet CV-12 and VF-30 from Belleau Wood, CVL-24 fought a 20-minute engagement, eventually destroying all 18 Bettys and 12 of their Zero fighter escorts. Lieutenant Junior Grade Murray Winfield of VF-17 shot down 4.5 Bettys, sharing the 5th destruction with an 4U pilot. VF-30's Ensign James V. Ward accounted for 3 Bettys. He came up under the large Betty formation, and to his surprise, he could see what appeared to be tiny aircraft hitching a ride beneath the ponderous, twin-engine Mitsubishi bombers. Not sure what the little planes were, Ward called them gizmos in his debrief. However, the name that has stuck through the years was the word for fool, baka. Okas scored their first success on April 1st, day for the Okinawa invasion. They hit and damaged 4 American ships, but did not sink their first victim until April 12th, when the destroyer Manat L. Abele DD 733 went down off Okinawa after taking kamikaze strikes from a bomb-carrying Zero and an Oka. The same day, another destroyer, Stanley DD 478, took 2 Oka strikes in 10 minutes but survived. 74 Okas sortied beneath their Betty carrier planes, and 56 were released or shot down while still attached to their mother aircraft. 50 Okas were lost when the giant carrier Shinano was sunk on November 29, 1944, off the port city of Osaka by the United States submarine Archerfish. While perhaps the most common form of suicide attack vehicles and crew, aircraft were not the only type of the fearsome weapon. They designed the Chiton, a modification of the famous Long Lance torpedo, one of the best torpedoes of the war. The Chiton was 54 feet long and carried a huge 3,000-pound warhead. The Chiton went into battle on the deck of a submarine, and after its pilot had entered the torpedo, the Chiton launched, accelerating to its top speed of 40 knots. The pilot sat in a small compartment using a periscope to navigate toward his target. The first Chiton operations in November 1944 involved VP-17, a squadron of PBM mariners based at Ulithi Atoll, a major United States anchorage. VP-17's crew number 1 flew 5 night patrols around the harbor and engaged Chitons twice. On November 16th, crew number 1 was nearing the end of their patrol just before dawn when their radar operator got a contact running on the surface. The target turned out to be the Imperial Navy submarine I-36. Alerted for action, the PBM crew dropped sonobuoys over the bubbles left by the submarine, which had crash-dived at the mariner's approach. 3 nights later, the I-47 launched 4 Chitons, and the I-36 launched one against the Ulithi anchorage. Crew number 1 was up at this time too, and saw a ship erupt in flames. It was the fleet oiler Mississiniwa AO-59 carrying 400,000 gallons of aviation fuel. The oiler went down at anchor, along with 50 of her crew. On June 28, 1945, the destroyer Sproston DD 577 was attacked by a Chiton launched from the submarine I-36 near the Marshall Islands. Lookouts had spotted the telltale wake of a periscope, and the destroyer turned toward the threat. The submarine's crew was intent on watching the Chiton's progress and did not see or hear the destroyer approach on a ramming course. Finally, a sonarman alerted the skipper, who crash-dived to escape the looming destroyer. Although the collision was missed by scant feet as the sub slid beneath the tin can, Sproston Depth charged the I-36. Hampered by its load of Chitons, the I-36 was moments away from sinking. Several Chiton pilots volunteered to counterattack. Launching from the stricken submarine, one of them headed toward the American destroyer, but the gun crew on Sproston were ready and blasted the conning tower off the suicide torpedo. Distracted by the Chiton attack, the destroyer turned away from the I-36, which escaped, arriving back in port by July 6. Ultimately, the Chitons were not as successful as the conventional kamikaze vehicles. Chiton attacks accounted for only 2 United States ships sunk, while 8 of the submarine carriers were sunk, along with their crew and Chiton pilots. Another dedicated kamikaze design was the Nakajima Ki-115 Tsurugi Sabre. 105 of which were produced between March and August 1945. None of these small single-engine aircraft was used in combat. However, their main use was intended for the anticipated invasion of the home islands that would come sometime in 1946. While all types of aircraft were used in kamikaze operations, some were heavily modified for the special attack mission. One such modification was the Ki-67I KAI, a variant of the highly successful Mitsubishi Ki-67 Hiryu Flying Dragon, codenamed Peggy by the Allies. One of the Imperial Army's best bombers, the twin-engine Hiryu, was fast, lending itself to the kamikaze mission. The bomber's gun turrets were removed and the normal six-man crew reduced to three. A long nose-mounted rod would explode the warload, which could be two 800-kilogram bombs or a single 2,900-kilogram charge. Kamikaze attacks continued unabated through most of the last 6 months of the war, wherever and whenever they could assemble a strike force. The massive Allied fleet, spearheaded by United States ships and aircraft carriers filled with thousands of sailors and Marines, took the brunt of the terrifying suicide dives. The only defense seemed to be smothering curtains of anti-aircraft fire and orbiting patrols of fighters, whose pilots often braved their own forces' flak to get to the frantic pilots bent on their own destruction. In truth, they were not in complete agreement amongst themselves as to the value and effectiveness of their suicide squadrons. Top fighter Ace Saburo Sakai had originally supported the formation of the kamikazes. Badly wounded over Guadalcanal in August 1942, he had lost most of the sight in his right eye, yet had returned to full flight status by early 1944 and went on a one-way mission in early July 1944. Based on Iwo Jima, Sakai took off at 1600 hours with 8 other Zero pilots and 8 torpedo bombers to strike American ships to the south. The light began to go and the weather worsened. The pilots could not find their targets, and soon they were engaged by the Hellcat Combat Air Patrol. Under orders to avoid aerial combat, Sakai and his fellow escort pilots desperately tried to escape until they realized there was no other way but to shoot their way out of the trap. Sakai shot one Grumman fighter down, but as the weather deteriorated, he decided to ignore orders and bring his flight home. Enraged and embarrassed at being sent out on this futile mission, Sakai was gratified to find that other pilots had also decided to abort the mission. Later on, he realized how ineffective the kamikazes had been, no matter how pure their motivation. He questioned the obvious pressure the young, inexperienced pilots were under to volunteer and carry out their missions. Failing to enthusiastically volunteer was a disgrace to the family and to oneself. Sakai also knew that many attacks had resulted in only misses. As a former test pilot, he knew that the lightly built aircraft, such as the Zero, were not intended for near-vertical dives and frequently broke apart under the stress of the dive. In the final months of the war, July and August, as they waited for the inevitable invasion of the home islands, they consolidated their remaining resources, marshalling the last aircraft, crew, and bombs to confront the huge Allied fleet that would soon appear off the beaches of the home islands. Aviation gasoline was scarce, and schoolchildren scoured mountain forests to gather pine cones to process into oil that would fuel ancient biplane trainers for a huge, final kamikaze attack. Although kamikaze strikes continued till the end of the war, no greater concentration was mounted than during the 3-month Okinawa campaign. Men and ships that had survived previous combat tours perished in the flames of the diving Zeros. Actually, Zeros were only a portion of the different types that they used. Anything that flew and could carry a bomb eventually made the one-way mission. For the kamikaze pilots, the main prize was either the battleship or the aircraft carrier. 2 big attack carriers became symbols of the kamikaze campaign, as they weathered devastating attacks but survived to return home. Franklin CV-13 took a kamikaze strike on March 19, 1945, while engaged in strikes against the home islands. The aircraft and its 2 small bombs exploded on the hangar deck, eliminating everyone in the area and starting more fires around other aircraft that were fueled and armed. Waiting to go on another strike, smoke and fire quickly enveloped the stricken carrier as her men strove to save her. Franklin eventually made it back to the States under her own power to be repaired, having lost 832 of her crew. On May 11, 1945, Bunker Hill CV-17 took a Zero, then a Judy dive bomber, which also released a bomb before it crashed onto the carrier's flight deck. As her crew fought the fire, Task Force Commander Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher had to transfer his flag to another ship. Finally, the fires were brought under control and, with 389 dead, Bunker Hill also returned to the United States. Another veteran carrier to be hit by kamikazes was Enterprise CV-6. At one time in mid-1942, the only operating American carrier in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. Although damaged on March 20, 1945, Enterprise was repaired at Ulithi and returned to the fight. However, on May 14th, an early morning attack by kamikazes did far more damage to the Big E. A bomb, carrying Zero, hit the carrier's flight deck just behind the forward elevator. The Zero pilot, originally mistakenly identified as Tomi Zai, was actually Lieutenant Junior Grade Shunsuke Tomiyasu. Superb preparedness and firefighting techniques saved the ship from the breadth of damage suffered by Franklin and Bunker Hill. But the strike was enough to take the carrier out of the war for good, although she remained on station for 2 more days before heading for Pearl Harbor. When they accepted Allied terms for surrender on August 14, 1945, some 2,600 kamikaze sorties had been flown. For such a simple, non-technical weapon, the suicide squadrons caused a lot of damage and eliminated a lot of people besides their own pilots. In May alone, kamikazes eliminated 330 carrier crewmen, destroyed 90 carrier aircraft, and put 4 fleet carriers out of action, not to mention other damaging attacks against other carriers and other ships like destroyers, cruisers, and battleships. Overall, 474 United States ships were victims of kamikaze attacks, and 3,253 officers and men were eliminated. 3 escort carriers were sunk, and 28 other carriers damaged, including 12 big fleet carriers. Several carriers took 2 or more strikes, sometimes on the same day. Intrepid CV-11 and Enterprise each sustained 4 separate kamikaze hits, while Franklin was hit twice before the cataclysmic strike on March 19, 1945. For all the terrifying holocaust of the kamikazes, the eventual outcome of the war was never in doubt. What Admiral William F. Halsey, commander of the United States Third Fleet, referred to as the only weapon I feared in the war, did little to forestall the Allied victory. After the war, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific, said, "Nothing that happened during the war was a surprise except the kamikazes. We had not visualized these." Learning of the Emperor's acceptance of the Allies' surrender terms on August 15th, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi followed the young pilots of his kamikaze corps and committed suicide, leaving a note which said, in part, "I wish to express my deep appreciation to the souls of the brave special attackers. They fought and died valiantly. In death, I wish to atone for my part in the failure to achieve victory. I wish the young people to find a moral in my death. To be reckless is only to aid the enemy. You are the treasure of the nation. Strive for the welfare and for peace throughout the world." The Allied offensive now began to close on the Philippines. By mid-1944, the plan called for the Central Pacific Striking Force to capture Peleliu, Angkor, Ulithi, and Yap in the Western Carolines. At the same time, it would support General Douglas MacArthur as he leapfrogged through Morotai into Mindanao. The 2 forces would then combine to land on Leyte shortly before Christmas, 1944. In the meanwhile, the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed that MacArthur merely establish airfields on Mindanao to obtain air superiority in the Philippines, then join the Central Pacific Force to land on Formosa and China. These, the chiefs reckoned, would provide excellent bases for cutting sea and air communications with the East Indies and for the projected invasion of the homeland. MacArthur took strong issue with this, arguing that liberation of the Philippines deserved priority. On August 26, 1944, Admiral William Halsey took command of the Central Pacific Force, which now became the Third Fleet. The fast carrier force became Task Force 38, with Admiral Mark Mitcher remaining in command. In mid-September, Halsey took Task Force 38 to hit the central Philippines to prepare the way for landings in the Carolines and on Morotai. At relatively small cost, carrier planes knocked out some 200 aircraft and sank 13 logistics ships. Halsey was convinced that the central Philippines were a poorly defended, hollow shell, and urged Nimitz to bypass the Palaos in favor of an early landing on Leyte. MacArthur, naturally, liked this idea. Nimitz still wanted the Palaos in hand before attacking the Philippines. The Joint Chiefs agreed with Nimitz about the Palaos, but decided to begin liberation of the Philippines with a landing on Leyte in October 1944. Capture of Morotai, Peleliu, and Angkor put army bombers within supporting range of the Philippines, and Ulithi became an essential advanced fleet base. Planes from bases in China and the South and Central Pacific now hit airfields within interference range of Leyte. On October 10, 1944, Task Force 38 began to attack Okinawa, Luzon, and Formosa. On October 20th, the 7th Fleet, under Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, put the 6th Army ashore, and Tacloban airfield was quickly seized. When the Marianas fell, the High Command drew a new plan, called Operation Show, Victory, to defeat the next American attack. In its essentials, land planes would mount a massive opening strike as naval forces converged to crush the invaders in a go-for-broke counterattack. Admiral Somu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet, read the first preliminary air attacks as the invasion itself and rushed every available airplane to the Philippines. Task Force 38 dropped a large wrench into his plan when it destroyed some 500 of these planes on the ground in pre-invasion attacks. As the 7th Fleet approached Leyte Gulf, Task Force 38 was in position east of the Philippines to support Kinkaid and be ready for any counterattack. Carriers under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa were training new air squadrons in the Inland Sea in an effort to replace their Philippine Sea losses. Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima had some surface warships in the Ryukyus. The submarine war against sealift had cut off most of the flow of oil from the East Indies to the homeland, and the bulk of the surface fleet was now at Linga Roads, near Singapore, close to the source of fuel. Here, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita had the main force of battleships and cruisers, including the 18.1-inch gunned battleships Yamato and Musashi. Kinkaid's invasion force arrived at the entrance to Leyte Gulf on October 17th to capture outlying islands and begin attack minesweeping. When Toyoda learned of this, he ordered his fleet to sea. The show plan called for Ozawa's carrier force to approach from the north in the hope of drawing Task Force 38 to meet it. The surface ships from Linga Roads would then form two battle groups and converge on Leyte Gulf. Kurita coming around the northern end of Samar with most of his ships, and Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura passing through Surigao Strait with the rest. Between them, if all went well, Kinkaid's amphibious ships would be destroyed. For easier understanding, American accounts call the task forces the Northern Force, Ozawa's carriers, Center Force, Kurita's surface striking group, and Southern Force, Nishimura, followed by Shima. The converging forces fought four widely separated engagements called the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, the Battle of Surigao Strait, the Battle off Samar, and the Battle of Cape Engano, all going to make up what has been called the last major naval action. Kurita sailed from Linga Roads on October 18th. 2 days later, as the landing forces went ashore on Leyte, he arrived at Brunei to refuel. In the morning of October 22nd, he put to sea with 5 battleships, including Yamato and Musashi, and 12 cruisers. Later that day, Nishimura departed Brunei for Surigao Strait with 2 battleships and 1 cruiser. Shima's 3 cruisers were underway from the Ryukyus with orders to form part of the Southern Force and cooperate with Nishimura in his attack. Ozawa sailed from the Inland Sea on the afternoon of October 22nd with large carrier CV Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Solomons, 3 smaller carriers CVLs, and 3 cruisers. He also had the battleships Isa and Hyuga, their after turrets replaced by an aircraft deck and catapults, referred to by American intelligence as BB-CV. Ozawa commanded a paper Tiger. His 4 carriers had 116 Planicite fighters and fighter bombers, 36 torpedo bombers among them. His BB-CV had no planes at all. This was of little import to Ozawa. His job was not to strike but to be struck. He expected to be destroyed. His sole task was to get Task Force 38 out of the way of the surface forces, to hold out the tempting bait of aircraft carriers in the hope that Halsey would go for it. In the evening of October 24th, Halsey began to receive contact reports. Ozawa was northeast of Cape Engano, the northeastern tip of Luzon, and heading south toward him. He soon made up his mind. At this time, Task Force 38 was made up of 4 task groups of 3 to 5 carriers apiece, with various mixes of screen ships. Task Group 38.1 under command Vice Admiral John McCain, CVs Wasp, Hornet, Intrepid, Hancock, CVLs Monterey Cowpens, 5 cruisers, 15 destroyers. Task Group 38.2 under command Rear Admiral Gerald Bogan, CV Intrepid, CVLs Cabot, Independence, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 18 destroyers. Task Group 38.3 under command Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman, CVs Essex, Lexington, CVLs Princeton, Langley, 1 battleship, 4 cruisers, 12 destroyers. Task Group 38.4 under Rear Admiral Ralph Davison, CVs Franklin Enterprise, CVLs San Jacinto, Belleau Wood, 3 battleships, 2 cruisers, 12 destroyers. The large carriers had from 83 to 101 planes each, in varying combinations of F-6F Hellcat fighters, SB-2C Helldiver bombers, and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. By this time, the old reliable Douglas SBD Dauntless had been completely replaced in the fleet by the SB-2C. CVL air groups numbered 26 to 35 F-6Fs and TBMs. Halsey rode with Bogan's Task Group 38.2, his flag in New Jersey BB-62. Kincaid, in Leyte Gulf, had 6 older battleships with 12 cruisers and 90 destroyers and frigates. Close air support came from the Escort Carrier Group Task Group 77.4 under Rear Admiral Thomas Sprague 3 task units with the radio call names of Taffy 1, 2, and 3. Each Taffy had 6 CVEs with 3 destroyers and 4 or 5 destroyer escorts. 4 Sangamon CVE-26 class ships had miniature air groups of 26 to 33 planes. The Sangamons, bigger than other CVEs, could handle the hotter F-6F, and 3 of the class had been rearmed with them. Santee CVE-29 still had General Motors FM2s, an improved CVE version of the older Grumman 4F Wildcat. The remaining CVEs were of the Casablanca CVE-55 class, each with a composite squadron of 23 to 30 FM2s and TBM Avengers. 3 of Task Force 38's task groups were off the Philippines. McCain's Task Group 38.1 was on its way to Ulithi to replenish. Halsey quickly ordered the 3 available groups to head north and rendezvous at midnight. Mitcher was then to continue with the united force and attack Ozawa as soon as he was within reach. The groups joined and Mitcher headed north. Independence, CVL-22, now a night carrier, flew radar, equipped search planes. Submarines sighted Kurita early on October 23rd and sent Halsey a contact report. The subs sank 2 cruisers, including Kurita's flagship, and crippled a third. Kurita shifted his flag to Yamato. Early on October 24th, he entered the Sibuyan Sea. At this time, carrier scouts discovered Kurita and Nishimura. Dive bombers damaged a battleship and a destroyer of the Southern Force, but Halsey judged Kurita to be the more serious threat. He ordered all 3 available groups to concentrate on the center force, leaving Nishimura to the 7th Fleet when the moment came, and ordered McCain's group back to the Philippines. As the strike on the center force was preparing, a search plane from Luzon spotted Sherman's Task Group 38.3. A heavy attack soon followed. As soon as this showed up on his radar, Sherman put off the strike he was about to launch, got all his fighters into the air, and turned into a rain squall. The raid was repelled with losses, but 1 dive bomber used cloud cover until he could drop his bomb on Princeton CVL-23. The blast ignited the plane's fuel tanks on the hangar deck. This set off torpedo warheads. Cruisers and destroyers closed the burning carrier to help her damage control parties. 6 hours of grueling work, punctuated by an ineffectual air raid from Ozawa's northern force, seemed to be bringing Princeton's fires under control until flames set off a torpedo magazine, blowing off the carrier's stern. Cruiser Birmingham, alongside for some hours fighting fires, was sprayed with debris, eliminating or injuring some 600 men. Fires now threatened aviation, gas tanks, and other magazines. and Princeton had to be sunk by destroyer torpedoes. While Princeton fought to survive, Task Force 38 opened the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Air Command on Luzon had decided its inexperienced flyers could be more useful attacking Task Force 38 than trying to fly cover, so Kurita was practically without air support when the first air strike came in. 4 aircraft were downed and no more were seen. During the next 4 hours, Task Force 38 made 5 strikes against heavy anti-aircraft fire, hammering 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes into Musashi. The battleship rolled over and sank that evening. A torpedo damaged cruiser Myoko's propeller shafts and made her turn for home. Battleships Yamato, Nagumo, and Haruna took damage, but continued on at speed. Even with Musashi and Myoko gone, the center force still carried a serious punch. Kurita turned to stand by his damaged ships, then headed westward. Pilots reported this to Halsey, who read this as a retreat. Kurita, though, had not given up but was drawing back to avoid further airstrikes. Shortly before sunset, he again reversed course and headed for San Bernardino Strait. From Tokyo, a general message from Toyota came to the task forces. All forces will advance to the attack, trusting in divine assistance. Task Force 38 had seriously delayed Kurita. He had originally planned to be through San Bernardino Strait by the evening of October 24th, but now estimated that he would be through by about 1 o'clock on the 25th and would reach Leyte Gulf by about 11 o'clock. He was spotted twice on radar by search planes from Independence, but Halsey was looking toward Ozawa's northern force and assumed Kinkaid would be able to defend himself. Nishimura, at this time, was heading across the Mindanao Sea toward Surigao Strait, followed, 40 miles behind, by Shima. Though they were supposed to cooperate, they did not communicate. Each went his way in radio silence. In Leyte Gulf, Kinkaid thought that San Bernardino Strait was being watched by Halsey's fast battleships. Halsey had considered this when he ordered Task Force 38 northward, but decided he needed all his anti-aircraft firepower to defend his carriers against overestimated air strength. Exaggerated reports of ship damage in the Philippine Sea led Halsey to believe Kurita was so battered that Kinkaid could fend him off if he tried to attack Leyte Gulf. Kinkaid, believing his northern flank secure, set about defending the southern entrance to Leyte Gulf. After Nishimura and Shima were sighted by search planes early on October 24th, and Nishimura was attacked with slight results, neither force was spotted through the rest of the day. Kinkaid correctly assumed they were headed for Surigao Strait. He ordered Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf to the northern end of the strait with all the 7th Fleet's bombardment ships, 6 older battleships, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers. Oldendorf deployed his battleships across the mouth of the strait, flanked by cruisers and destroyers. PT boats were stationed down the strait and into the Mindanao Sea. Nishimura was approaching a 35-mile corridor of torpedoes and gunfire. When Nishimura learned of Kurita's delay in the Philippine Sea, he continued on course, assuming a night action would give him his best chance of getting through Surigao Strait. He endured PT attacks without harm, but destroyer torpedoes mortally hit battleship Fuse and damaged her sister Yamashiro. Yamashiro took 3 more torpedoes but continued on with cruiser Mogami and destroyer Shigur. Nishimura pushed boldly ahead, firing as best he could without radar, as Oldendorf's heavies repeatedly scored. Yamashiro, burning furiously, turned to withdraw but capsized and sank with her admiral and most of her crew. Mogami, battered and afire, headed southward and survived a collision with another cruiser, more cruiser gunfire, and 2 PT attacks. As Shima, still 40 miles astern of Nishimura, entered Surigao Strait, one of his cruisers was crippled by a PT torpedo. He continued, with the remaining 2 cruisers, past Fuse's flaming wreck but concluded that he was too late to help Nishimura and turned southward, picking up Mogami and Shigure. Shima got clear of the strait. Planes from the escort carriers spotted him in the Mindanao Sea and left Mogami dead in the water. Her crew abandoned ship and a destroyer sank her with a torpedo. Shima's surviving ships were attacked by carrier planes but escaped for the time being. Kurita emerged from San Bernardino Strait shortly after midnight on October 25th and turned toward Leyte Gulf. Messages told him that Nishimura was engaged in Surigao Strait and later that Shima was turning back. As daylight came, A lookout spotted an American plane and reported ships on the horizon. This was Taffy 3, one of the CVE task units, commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. This unit, and Taffy 2, some miles to the south, were the only naval forces between Kurita and Leyte Gulf. Identification of ships and aircraft has always been a problem. This worked in favor off Samar on the morning of October 25th, when they identified Taffy 3 as one of Task Force 38's groups. Kurita was less than enthusiastic about tackling such a force without air cover, and after his experience in the Sibuyan Sea, he doubted the worth of his anti-aircraft fire. But the enemy was on the horizon and it was time to fight. Instead of forming for action, he ordered a general attack. His ships made for the enemy independently, faster ships pulling ahead of the others. Sprague ordered Taffy 3 to steam eastward, away from Kurita, and more or less into the wind. As Kurita opened fire, he ordered all planes into the air with any ordnance at hand, and told every ship to make smoke. A plain language contact message gave the position and asked for assistance from anyone within reach. Planes went off the flight decks as fast as they could go, and others from Rear Admiral F.B. Stump's Taffy 2 joined in from over the horizon. Though many of its planes were already flying ground support missions, Taffy 2 sent out what it had and recalled everyone within reach. A rain squall helped conceal Taffy 3 for a while, as Kurita tried to pull to windward and compel Sprague to turn away from the wind. At 7:16, Sprague ordered his 3 destroyers to attack. Making smoke, the destroyers engaged with guns and torpedoes, damaging one of Kurita's cruisers. 4 destroyer escorts joined in. In the course of this confused duel, the small boys torpedoed 1, and possibly 3, cruisers. Kurita's flagship, Yamato, turned northward to evade torpedoes. By the time she could come about again, she was in the rear of the force, and this would hamper the Admiral's control of the rest of the action. Within 2 hours, cruisers and destroyers were edging up on Sprague's flanks as battleships and more cruisers drew up from astern. Taffy 3 had to come around to the southwest to stay between Kurita and Leyte Gulf and to keep from being surrounded, but this had the carriers launching planes before, rather than into, the wind. Sprague ordered his planes to concentrate on 4 cruisers that were pulling up on Taffy 3's port quarter. As the CVEs dodged salvos of shells, they popped away with the single 5-inch 38 guns on their fantails. Smoke and zigzagging helped, but 3 CVEs were hit. Kincaid's support aircraft commander ordered all planes not actually in combat elsewhere to go to Taffy 3's aid, and some of these arrived to help. The situation was just too chaotic for neat coordination, though this was tried. The carrier pilots bombed, strafed, attacked with torpedoes, and made dry runs when ammunition ran out, anything to give the jeeps a chance to survive. Steaming pell-mell with the wind, the CVEs could hardly worry about recovering planes. When a pilot needed munitions or fuel, he had to rely on Taffy 2 or fly to Tacloban. Gambia Bay CVE 73 was closest to the pursuers. At first, she dodged their fire, but as the range closed, she began to take hits. Flooding and aflame, she dropped out of formation. Destroyers bravely attacked, but Gambia Bay hit repeatedly, capsized and sank. 3 cruisers were out of the fight, battered by gunfire and the heroic efforts of the CVE flyers. The rest of Center Force broke off action shortly after 9 o'clock. Kurita now knew that Nishimura had been crushed in Surigao Strait, and aggressive and repeated attacks by planes and ships convinced him that he faced major opposition. Before 9:30, he turned back towards San Bernardino Strait. The attackers had turned back only 25 miles from their objective. Kurita's sudden disappearance, when things seemed to be going his way, seemed miraculous to Taffy 3. Planes from the CVEs followed Kurita as the Admiral weighed his next move. When the center force turned to withdraw, the planes attacked, damaging battleship Nagato. Planes from McCain's Task Group 38.1 attacked at a range of more than 350 miles, claiming many hits but apparently doing little damage. Another strike went in that afternoon from Taffy 2, but without result. McCain continued to head for Samar as Halsey ordered Bogan's Task Group 38.2 to join him for a combined attack on October 26th. 3 strikes hit Kurita as he retired through the Sibuyan Sea, sinking a cruiser and severely damaging another. Army bombers also claimed to have hit 3 Center Force ships. Much of Kurita's force survived, but to little effect through the remainder of the war. At 2022, on October 24th, Halsey turned Task Force 38 northward after Ozawa. His 3 task groups totaled 5 fleet carriers and 5 small carriers, with 6 fast battleships, 8 cruisers, and 41 destroyers. Against this, Ozawa had 4 carriers, 1 CV, 3 CVLs, the 2 hybrid Ice-class BB, CVs, 3 cruisers, and 4 destroyers. By now, the Northern Force's air strength had been whittled down to 29 planes. Ozawa advanced to meet Halsey, expecting, as he later said, complete destruction. Night flyers from Independence picked up the Northern Force on radar after 2 o'clock. Halsey now pulled out his battle line, Task Force 34, and took it ahead to engage anything left afloat by the airstrikes planned for the morning. The carriers launched a first attack after dawn. A few fighters met them and were quickly splashed. Dive bombers and 39 torpedo planes sank CVL Chitose and a destroyer, damaging CV Zuikaku and CVL Zuiho. A second attack crippled CVL Chiyoda and damaged a cruiser. At this point, Halsey began to receive messages from Taffy 3 calling for support. He now knew that Nishimura had been turned back from Surigao Strait and still felt that Kinkaid's force was sufficient. A message went to McCain, still en route to the Philippines, to make best possible speed to Taffy 3's assistance. Admiral Nimitz now sent Halsey the famous, "Where is Task Force 34?" message. Halsey's communications staff mistook random words called padding. At the end of the message for part of Nimitz's text and gave it to Halsey at 10 o'clock with the additional phrase, "The world wonders," added to it. This enraged Halsey, who took it as an insult. Feeling increasingly compelled to turn back from his pursuit of Ozawa, Halsey took Task Force 34 southward at 11:15, picking up Bogan's task group for air cover. Mitchell continued north with his 2 remaining task groups. At midday, they launched their third strike, sinking Zuikaku and badly damaging Zuiho. 2 afternoon attacks sent Zuiho down and scored some near misses on BB, CVIs. In mid-afternoon, Mitchell turned eastward to avoid getting his carriers too near Ozawa's surface ships and sent warships to finish off Chiyoda. A seeming footnote to the Battle of Leyte Gulf proved a harbinger of things to come. In the morning of October 25th, suicide planes found Thomas Sprague's Taffy 1 off Mindanao. Some of the attackers were put off by gunfire, but 2 hit Santee and Suwannee CVE-27. A submarine then eluded the screen and torpedoed Santee. Both carriers managed to stay in formation and make repairs and later resumed flight operations. Another group of suicide aircraft struck Taffy 3, damaging Kitkun Bay CVE-71 and Kalinin Bay CVE-68 and mortally wounding St. Lo CVE-63. The mobile power of the fleet and escort carrier forces was essential to the success of the Leyte landing. Experience at Leyte pointed to a need for flexibility in carrier plane complements and ordnance loads, with proportions of fighters to attack types and types of weapons carried varying to suit the operation at hand.